Hello, welcome to this week's review of My Hero Academia. This week I'm reviewing the episode Battle Without a Quirk, and we kick off this review as we always do these reviews by talking about the positives. Well, this is the final episode of Season 7, and the first half of this episode is a great way to end Toga's time in the series. Potentially, though, more on that idea later on. All Might fighting All for One was a visual and emotional thrill, and all of this makes for a fine final episode with a decent final image. Whilst there is an argument to be made that the true emotional heart of this episode lies in the first half of it, I'm sure that there are many people that will argue that the second half for them hits harder, but needless to say, for me, as I really did think that the stronger half of this episode certainly was that first half, certainly from a drama and character point of view, and needless to say that what was alluded to in a comment in last week's video was true. This episode is one hell of an emotional roller coaster. There is a bit of tonal whiplash midway through this episode, but hey, I thought this episode was great overall. Whilst there was a part of me that wasn't exactly thrilled by the pre-title flashback, which then was flashed back to only a few minutes later, I have to say that the first half of this episode was near perfect. This is the dying embers of one of the most visually arresting fights of the season, and the dying embers of two of our cast members. One so consumed by their desire for rage that it burnt through them and what little power they had to change everything for the better, and now they must make the final sacrifice to do something good with their life that, regretfully, regardless of what they do, will only be remembered by the wider world as being a life of hatred and a cautionary tale or an urban legend. And the other main character in this particular half of the episode were so consumed by their own desire to be a hero, in intent and to truly be a hero, and to save all of those around them, no matter how dark they may seem. They have very little power left within them, and what little power that they do have is being used to save others with their dying breath on a battlefield where the scope of their sacrifice may never truly be known to the wider world, especially given the way they operate. But in the end, the hero saved the villain, now the villain is saving the hero. I was curious to see exactly how all this would have wrapped up last week. I was just really... There was a part of me that was fearful that this would only end up getting rounded off in such a way so that there could be a round 2 at some later point. Similar to what happened with Dabi and Shoto earlier on in this season. But this week pretty definitively draws a line under the fact that, yeah, Toga is gone. She's certainly not going to be coming back, though, of course, superhero fiction being what it is, but we'll discuss that shortly. It is honestly hard to discuss this one without echoing much of what I said last week, but this week there's just this bleak sense of hopelessness to much of what is happening here. We, as an audience, when we're watching this, are pretty much resigned to the reality that this can only end one way. The die was cast long ago, and now it's only for these two characters to deal with the path that they've both been sent down. Here, there is no final reconciliation, there's no final meeting, no escape, there is no "I'll get you next time" or "oh, we'll meet again." Just the grim reality of the situation at hand, with this situation being something that has been shown in a prior episode. The whole thing about the blood transfusion is not something that was just an arse pull to save Ochaco, it was something that was established a season or two ago, so we are paying off things that were established well back, even if at the time we didn't realise that they were foreshadowing stuff that would come later on. This whole act of sacrifice by Toga is a moment of redemption for them as a villain, and is a bittersweet look into the life that they could have had. They could have been the perfect blood donor given the way that their quirk works. They could have saved countless lives, been a greater hero than many of the pro heroes, and saved many more lives than many of them ever could have done. And yet by the circumstances of a horrific upbringing, that never happened. And this just creates this further sense of just how miserable this all is, but it's miserable in a way that feels human, in a way that feels tangible, in a way that feels grounded, in a way that is keeping with the moment, lockstep with the story and the tone of everything else, rather than happening for the sake of happening, or happening because, well, we're in the dark part of the story, so dark things need to happen. It's not being done in a way that feels self-indulgent or self-gratifying, or in a way to be edgy or a way to be moody. It's being done in a way which feels as though given how all of this panned out, this is the only way this realistically could have ended in a way that felt satisfactory, in keeping with everything that we've seen before and everything that exists as far as the greater tone and the real tone of this whole series. And we get this final callback to the Sparrow. I will admit that when that first came into play, especially when we saw that image of the blood surrounding Toga in that flashback thing, I think earlier on this season, that I was wondering how all of that would come into play. I was wondering how the Sparrow motif would come into play in the final moments of their story. I was wondering, how could it come into play in the final battle? Would she use some Sparrow blood to shoot sparrows out of the air or something? Or would she drink Sparrow blood and turn into a sparrow, then just escape to live her true life away from the dark, horrific world of man and just be the truer sense of self that she has? But in the end, the Sparrow imagery is a reflection of herself. Throughout this series, whenever we've seen the Sparrow and Toga, we've only ever seen the Sparrow wounded. We've only ever seen it bloodied and dying. And now, in these final moments, we see, as the character Toga is healed, that the Sparrow is healed. It is not bloodied, it is alive, and in the final image we see of it, it flies away off into the horizon, indicating that Toga has passed away. This is a representation in an abstract way of her soul. And look, let's just address the elephant in the room here. We are dealing with superhero fiction here, and a series which is still very popular, and with a character whom themselves is very popular. It's not beyond the realms of possibility that this character could come back in some way, shape or form in a movie or a spin-off. I hope that is not the case. I really hope that is not the case. But you never know with these things. I think that to a certain degree, that would ruin a lot of the good work that has been done here. And I don't think I could possibly think of a way in which it could be done in a way which is satisfactory. At most, the closest thing to that character coming back is maybe you have an image at some point of Ochaco looking up and seeing a little sparrow chirping on a branch and, thinking back to Toga, and that would be a great visual image to represent their influence still being around in some way, and still the connection and the memories that Ochaco has for that character. That would be fine for me, but anything beyond that point, I don't really think you can do. There's a part of me in the back of my mind was imagining that, what could they do for the next movie? Someone creates dark clones of the League of Villains, shadow versions of them, and that. Yeah, that would just turn my stomach if they ended up doing that, particularly just how well a lot of these characters are being written out. There is this grim acceptance in this episode that this is the way that things need to be. This is, like I've said previously, the end point of all of this. We have the repeated image of All for One, imagining all the paths that lead to his victory. Well, we're on one of those spines that just leads to one very definitive point, that being that one, either or both of them must die, and this is just capped off with some really strong, powerful imagery that just illustrates the end of a life that's filled with pain and the feeling of some sense of self-acceptance and the reality that this character has found some sense of peace in their final moments, and it makes for a really powerful first half of the episode. Look, there's always a part of me, and as people well familiar with my reviews will go, there's always this part of me that will think with stuff like this could have and should have been the ending to last week's episode. And is still a part of me that thinks that now, and there is still a part of me that thinks that this whole entire wrap-up could have been its own episode. I'm glad that we ended up getting it as much as we did do, because I think that this is one of those things where it's such a precious, delicate thing that if it's dragged out too long or done too short, it would have ended up thwarting the emotional impact of it. And I think that at the end of the day, it does everything that it needs to perfectly well. It hits that bullseye exactly. With all that said, moving on to something very different in tone, All Might is back and fighting on his feet once again for what may well be the final time, because, hey, remember Sir Night Eye's vision? Well, it's back into play again! Woohoo! Some of us are thinking that that vision might be more metaphorical, but it's looking that it might be more literal. I will admit that in the full interest of editorial transparency, I did know about the armour well ahead of time. but I thought that was going to be in addition to him getting healed by Eri. I didn't know the full details of this season. I know bits and bobs of it, so as a part of me thinking, okay, All Might's going to get healed by Eri, and then he's going to be in this super suit to help protect him from the decay, Quirk, and whatever else the villains might throw at him. But no, that really isn't the case. He gets an Iron Man suit. An Iron Man suit which may well be built by Melissa Shield or whatever her name is from the first movie. It might not be. The way that they actually discuss how it came into existence, it feels like he only most recently went over to the United States to make friends to make this suit. But I don't know. We can interpret it whichever way we want, because at the end of the day, where the suit came from isn't really important. One of the things I do like about this suit and how it's used is the simple fact that throughout this series, we've had the very, very loose implication that heroes without quirks, heroes without superpowers, are a thing that exist in this world, because let's be honest, how the hell did Midoriya think he was going to get into UA before he met All Might otherwise? There must be other quirkless superheroes out there that exist. Maybe they're not big names, but they have to exist in some regard. We've just never seen them in the main series, and with the odd exception, or in Vigilantes, we don't really see them there either, and in that case, the Vigilantes, not fully licensed heroes. So, this is the first time that we actually see a quirkless superhero fight. So it ends up boiling down to, well, how will that work? Well, you just be Iron Man. So the cure for a lack of superpowers is money! Which, again, weirdly keeps in the tone of a lot of the darker subtext of this series, but hey-ho, it still makes for a very visually arresting image. I will say, as though, that one thing that I did have an issue with, and this is something that I will reflect on later on, is that I really don't like the colouring of All Might's suit. I think it's way too dark given everything he's standing around, but we'll discuss that shortly. I will have to say is that one of the things I do like about this whole sequence of events is that this is another character resorting to desperate measures to try and save the day. And when the show has lent into that desperation of the situation that characters find themselves in, with people just throwing everything at the problem to try and solve it, or try and buy time, much like the Peach gag earlier on with Lemillion, that is stuff that I like. It feels in keeping with the reality of the situation at hand, and it's one of the reasons why I liked most of Z more so than Super, because of the fact that it was a case of, what have we got, throw it at the problem, and maybe this will be the thing that fixes it. And here it is the case. All Might has to at least slow down All for One in some way, so he uses this super suit to try and do that. He's throwing himself at the problem in the hope that at the very least he can buy time for everyone else. Maybe he could win, maybe he can't, he doesn't know, because let's face it, he had this suit built well in advance of all of this, so it's not like he could come up with something more specific than all of this. He knows All for One's tricks. He has realised how this healing thing works, and even though this all may well likely lead to his death, he's doing everything in his power to stall for as long as possible. Again, I do wish the colour palette for all of this was better, because the action that we get is great with some really brilliant visuals. This dark, almost beetle-looking armour that All Might is wearing with this wide, sinister smile on his face makes him look like a skeleton in a suit of armour, when All Might is just cackling away almost like a villain would do when he's figuring something out. This creates for this creepy visual, and the shot from behind of him through the chain link fence, we're seeing how twisted and banged up his body is horrific. It's showing All Might as becoming this almost figure of death, this Grim Reaper-like figure for All for One, and that's really wild to me, just how sinister and dark and twisted they're making such a wholesome and lovable superhero look. Of course, all of his gadgets are themed on the powers of his students, and this reflects the fact that he believes in them and they believe in him. He inspires them, they inspire him. He's doing this for them and they are doing this for him. Each one of the gadgets from a pure just comic book superpower punchy action time is neat. It feels weird to talk about the action stuff so late into the episode, but I like the way in which there are all these callbacks to all the different people in the class to some regard or another. One thing I would really like to see at least at some point in the next, whenever it comes up, probably this time next year, If there's a moment where it looks like All For One's about to deal the final blow on All Might, and then the equivalent of the naval laser just flies out and smacks into All For One, just like I say, another just final fuck you from Aoyama and his family. Like, that would be a neat little thing. Like, once again, he gets caught out by that guy because he wasn't expecting it. Like, and of course, in that sequence, we get the final rundown of all our cast members who are still conscious. Which, to be fair, is just them setting the stage and dedicating the time to say, these are the guys we're going to be focusing on in the next season, however long and short that may end up being. The next season is going to be the last one. A post-credit scene confirms that being the fact. Again, how long and short it might be, I don't know. I've got some theories, which I might well discuss in a future video, but we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. But now it's time to cross a different bridge, as now we talk about the negatives. There aren't that many negatives, I have to say, and I will admit that a lot of them are nitpicks, so I won't lean too heavily into them. But first of all, as I've said previously, I'm not keen on the idea of flashing back to a flashback that we've already just had. Having the brief bit of the "do you think I'm cute" thing, or whatever exactly the words were in the pre-title sequence, is fine. That works. It's a great way to remind us of the previous episode, but to have that and immediately flash back to it only a few moments later, that doesn't make sense to me. In any capacity, that just doesn't make sense to me because we already know it. So you either cut that from the pre-title sequence, or you cut it as being a flashback, but it works better as being a flashback, so just cut it from the pre-title sequence. But then I am fully aware that in some territories, after a television program has had its opening crawl, its opening sequence, then immediately they'll go to commercial break. So, hey, maybe after about 5 minutes of adverts for life insurance, boner pills, and God knows whatever else, yeah, you need that to be reminded, but hey ho, diddly do, we move on. As I mentioned previously, I think that whilst All Might's armour looks good, the colouring for it is just terrible. I don't know if this is just my monitor, but having a dark grey suit of armour on a dark grey background oftentimes makes it hard for him to see him. And whilst there are these accents on the armour, these accents of blue and of gold, they're so very few and far between that it does take away from what otherwise could be some really arresting visual imagery. Yes, it does make certain powers and certain abilities stand out a lot more, but not to the extent that I really wish they should do. But that's just the way that it is. I think that, well, like I said, I knew about this in advance, and the design that I saw had it was more of a dark blue, more so than a dark grey, and I wish they'd have gone more for that, as at the very least it would give more of a nod to the hero suit that we know him best as wearing. And, look, I think that the final image that we get, that split shot between All Might and Midoriya, whilst it is great thematically, I just don't think it's strong artistically. I think that it needed just it needed drawing in such a way that it made it look a lot more spectacular than it is, because at the moment it kind of ends up just looking like just taking two random snapshots and then putting them next to each other, because this is what we should be doing, but at the end of the day they lack the impact that a final shot of a season, particularly the final shot before we get into the final season, ends up doing. I think it needed to be stronger. I think it works conceptually, but just visually it just doesn't have that. With all that said and done, let us get into the overview, and I think that this is a great episode. How I'd rank it as far as final episodes of a season go is harder to say, because whilst there is a great emotional moment towards the start of this episode, there is a part of me that feels as though it lacks the emotional impact overall to really sell this season as a whole entity. But at the end of the day, I put that down to the simple fact that this is ending midway through a story arc. I think that, if anything, just the visual image of All Might putting on the suit on might have been a strong enough image to end the season on, rather than getting us into the fight immediately thereafter. But that's just the way this all hands out, because of just the way that all of this has been adapted and translated from the manga. I'm not familiar with the manga apart from everything that's been spoiled for me. Please, for the love of God, no more spoilers, but I still think that at the end of the day, this is a strong ending to a strong season. I prefer this season much more so than last year's season, but still, with all that said and done, let's get into Comment Corner! It's time for Comment Corner, starting off with Big X1 once again. He says, I like this one a lot, this of course referring to last week's episode, but I want to see what was happening with All Might. But this is still a good episode, even if I may not have been into it as much as you are. Thank you for your comment, and that of course referring to the episode A Girl's Ego, which I still think is a fantastic episode. I think that pound for pound it might have been better than this one. But still, I think it is a great episode in and of its own right. By all means, everyone go back and watch that video, watch that episode. And also watch the Dragon Ball Daima one, because that seems to be dying on its ass after only one thing, at least as far as the views on my channel are concerned. But hey, maybe it'll get a second win when it gets its international release next week. But anyway, the next comment comes from a Scott TV Gamer who says, as an adaptation, this was pretty much perfect. Easily surpassed the manga, no complaints. Next week will be a weird one. It'll start covering my absolute favourite part of this entire arc, and the cliffhanger is sure to be wild. But for anime-only viewers, you're in particular, all I can say is you're going to have a severe whiplash in the first half, which, yes, is very much so the case. First half of this episode is just rather miserable, but at least in a miserable way that I can enjoy, as much as that makes me sound like a psychopath. And the second half of the episode is certainly more heroic and thrilling, but we'll see where all that goes when we come back in a year's time. But of course, between then and now, next week, I will be doing my season-long review, so let me know what you thought about of this season as a whole. If you don't want to talk about this season as a whole, let me know what you thought about this episode, and vice versa. Let me know what you thought about this episode, let me know how the way you all this is going. Sorry, I got a little bit distracted by something then. But anyway, thank you all for listening, thank you all for watching, and see you next time. Goodbye!